Well, welcome to Why Biotech Success Requires Early Commercialization Strategy. And it is Julien Willard, and my guest today is Maxim Miller. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll break down why clinical data alone rarely guarantees uptake, how investors now underwrite market access risk, why will exit before launch is not a strategy, and what to prioritize early to avoid avoidable failures. Good morning, Maxime.
Good morning.
Well, let's start. Many biotech leaders assume if the data are good, adoption will follow. So, why is that no longer true?
I think I call it the field of dreams theory. And I think, unfortunately, it only works or comes to fruition in movies. I think to a certain extent, it's predicated upon false hope. So, yes, if you have a truly revolutionary breakthrough therapy, it may work. You may develop it, you may have unimpeded access, and you will attain tremendous success. But unfortunately, that's not how the market generally works, especially in the US with our really complicated healthcare system and the challenges that come from an access perspective. So that's why I think that just science, overwhelming majority of the time, is not enough. A really quick example, this is going back several years. I was working for a manufacturer, and we had a product in development. It was early phase 2. From a scientific perspective, it was fantastic. Anytime that we would put it in front of KOLs, their eyes would literally light up. It was really novel from an MOA perspective, and they loved the way that it worked versus alternatives. The challenge came in from an access and a commercialization perspective. The standard of care literally cost pennies, and our product was 1,000 times X. So even though the science was awesome, there's no other way to describe it. It was just awesome. But commercially, that product just was not viable. There's no way that we could have gone to healthcare systems and say, hey, instead of product that costs you 15 cents, how would you like to spend X number of hundreds of dollars per dose? So that was a deal breaker. And that's, I think, a really good example where the science works. The science is great. But if you don't consider some of the commercial considerations, it may not succeed.
This is a very good perspective, and as a health economist, I worked with so many pharmaceutical companies. And I've seen this over and over again, exactly the story that you're describing. I always tell clients that market access planning needs to start well before the pivotal design. That early scientific advice with HTA bodies and payer advisory boards also can inform your endpoints, comparators, and the evidence generation to support reimbursement. Um, there's another company that I think is worth talking about is Alnylam. I think their strategic approach with their drug Onpattro, before their therapy even hit the market, they invested heavily in building relationships with payers, developing their medical affairs capabilities, and this early groundwork paid off dramatically. They achieved access for over 90% of United States covered lives and secured 45 value-based agreements across their portfolio. So this is a great example of the proactive market access strategy that enabled rapid global expansion to, I believe, over 30 markets. But you work with a lot of investors. What are investors really underwriting today beyond the science?
I think that at least what I'm hearing is de-risk as much as possible. in a tough economic climate and with the degree of uncertainty that we have, I think that that's the expectation, is to mitigate against all risks that you possibly can. Yes, given the nature of clinical development, some things you can't de-risk. But to the extent possible, I think what they want to see is as much due diligence and do the absolute utmost to de-risk the assets.
I would agree with you. I also see this in the recent pattern of financing deals. For example, royalty financing has really picked up. Usually it used to be the last option to be considered, and now it's the first option to consider. And when you think about the royalty financing deals that we're seeing now, they're all done into late stage assets, low risk, guaranteed return.
And I think that this may be not the best metaphor, but it's, if you're going on a hiking trip, right?
Hmm.
You have to prepare for the climate that you're going into. And I think that that's an opportunity for biotechs and for pharma
Hmm.
to be more cognizant of the environment where they're going to have to succeed. So when it is a more challenging and a more unpredictable environment from a regulatory perspective and from a financial perspective, expectations change. You can't have the same approach that you did during the golden years when essentially checks were being handed out left and right. It's unrealistic. The investors' expectations change. They adapt due to the climate. And I think that it's the responsibility is on biotech and pharma to adjust to those expectations.
Yes. And so returning back to where we started, what investors are underwriting beyond science, I think what I've recently heard from a few folks, and including the JP Morgan conference, is that pricing and reimbursement are cited as the number one industry concern for 2025. The health technology assessment, scrutiny, and reference pricing increase increased launch delays and price pressures. Um, and I think market access has moved upfront in diligence and deal evaluations post IRA. Um, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes. Again, more challenging climate, higher expectations. But I also think that market access has always been important.
Hmm.
That has never really changed. I think that because of some of the changes in legislation, like you alluded to, IRA,
Hmm.
now we're talking about MFN, um, and there are a slew of other acronyms and considerations that you need to think through as you commercialize your product, whatever that may look like. All of those things have a role and they have an impact. And I
Yeah.
think that's again where the onus is on the biotech and the pharma companies is to make those adjustments. To use another metaphor, I don't think that if you're looking at clinical development and market access, it shouldn't be a relay race where you go through the clinical development and then you pass the baton to the commercial team to take care of the access. That just in today's climate, it just simply doesn't work. I saw something this morning in Script or in Pink Sheet. Um, Essentially, one of the HTAs outside of the U.S. urging biotech and pharma companies to seek their advice. So when they come to the table for the actual assessment, they're prepared. And they don't miss the mark. They coverage that they're looking for, because it just, and it happens, and it happens frequently, as evidenced by the fact that they're making this public, is this is available. So why not take advantage of it instead of following a more traditional path and essentially, to a certain extent, potentially setting yourself up for failure?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think it shouldn't be a relay race. It should be a tandem exercise. And we'll get into it in one of the upcoming questions or topics that we cover. But doing the due diligence as it relates to access doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to be cost prohibitive. It's like when you're back in elementary school or middle school. Yes, if you wait until the last minute, it's going to seem insurmountable. But if you space it out and you take kind of like a quick approach where you take small incremental steps over an extended period of time, it is much more manageable and you will get better outcomes.
So we also hear from some of our clients, we won't launch, we're going to sell the asset. In your perspective, why do you think this is a risky approach, and how should teams think about exit versus commercialization?
So I think the simple answer first. So even if you're selling your asset, whatever that looks like, whatever the exit strategy may look like, this is just my perspective. I would want to know everything that I could possibly know to get maximum return on the asset that I've developed. You're essentially, by not doing the due diligence, you're foregoing or you're giving up leverage, because the investor, whoever is making that investment, whoever is signing that check, typically they're going to do that due diligence. So you're putting yourself at a disadvantage at a bare minimum. And then, as we talked about in terms of the emphasis on de-risking assets, doing that due diligence as it relates to the competitive environment, as it relates to access, those are key boxes that need to be checked in order for you to be successful, whether you decide to exit, sell it, or whether you decide to commercialize the asset, possibly with the help of a partner. The exit strategy is almost irrelevant. At the end of the day, the building blocks are still the same.
One question to this. So don't you think that some company, well, at least I heard this from several clients, that we don't want to overbuild our commercial infrastructure? Is it a valid concern?
Yes, absolutely. It's expensive. But at the same time, there are ways that you could approach it, again, small incremental steps. I'm not a runner. I cycle. And I guess it applies to cycling as well. But they tell you that every marathon runner, every race starts and you get through a marathon one step at a time. There's no magical solution where you could where you could skip the steps and magically get through a marathon that way. So the same applies to market access and doing your due diligence. It's small incremental steps, because if you do wait until later in phase 2, it is going to be overwhelming from a commercial perspective in terms of building out the commercial team and some of the components that you'll need to focus on. That there is a significant investment that's involved. But if you take a more incremental approach, you could break up that investment. And the added advantage or benefit that you gain is it will help to inform some of those later clinical trials. where you won't need to pivot. And any pivot as it relates to clinical development comes with a really hefty price tag. And in some cases, it could completely destroy the value prop of an asset if you don't have that understanding, if you don't have that knowledge. Because in some cases, you can't course correct. It's just not possible because of the competitive environment, because of access, for a multitude of reasons. There are instances where you can't course correct, or you simply may not have enough cash to course correct.
So, hypothetically speaking, let's say if we were, you and I, to lead a phase 1 or 2 biotech today, what do you think we should prioritize in the next 6 to 12 months?
I think that it's doing that due diligence and breaking it up into chunks. So, specifically, you're not going to learn everything because you don't know everything about your product. If you're talking about phase 1 or even early phase 2, but you can easily understand who are the prescribers, what are the payer expectations, what does the competitive landscape look like, what is the standard of care, how does your product compare to that SOC, and what are the key drivers of differentiation. You don't need to have a fully fleshed out TPP to do any of that due diligence that I just described. But doing that due diligence will put you in a really good position and inform your later phase 2 trials and ultimately inform your pivotal trials. And that's where the real cost comes in.
How many clients do you see that delay these conversations, the engagement with payers and HTA bodies until phase 3? Is it the majority of the biotech?
What is said is that there is recognition that that you do need to start earlier on those initiatives. What I see happening is the traditional approach still prevailing of I'm going to wait until late phase 2, maybe even phase 3 once I start building out the commercial team, and then I'll worry about access. But the problem with that, again, is that you're not putting them in a position to succeed. Best case scenario, they may need to course correct. Worst case scenario, again, you're putting yourself in a really difficult situation where, and I've seen it, where the commercial team gets built out and they're handed kind of, this is what we have. Okay, great. I can't do anything with it. Or if I do anything with it, these are the financial outcomes. And it doesn't at all align with the expectations of the senior leadership. So it puts everyone in a really difficult position and decreases the overall likelihood of success if you continue to follow the traditional path of delaying and postponing any type of due diligence related to commercialization of a product.
This is a very good perspective. Most of the clients that I have interacted with, they assume an exit is going to solve their commercialization problem. But what we're seeing is that buyers really penalize excess risk and weak TPPs, and all it leads to is lowering the deal value and delays that exit that everybody wants. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about some practical cases. I know that you recently were involved in a few RFPs. Can you share with me and our listeners the pragmatic cases that actually illustrate early commercialization strategy making or breaking outcomes?
I'll talk about breaking outcomes. I'll let you speak to the positive side of it. So there were a couple of RFPs that I received recently within the last 6 to 12 months. both, one was a medical intervention and one was, we'll call it medical device slash digital therapeutic. And both of them did not get payer coverage. In both instances, they were deemed not medically necessary. So their question was, how do we fix it? One of these manufacturers was fixated on patient outcomes, PROs. They viewed that as the solution. And my feedback to them based on the competitive set is that you can try. You could make that investment of X number of millions of dollars to try to get that data. But ultimately, that's not going to help you positively differentiate versus the competitors. And the other huge challenge is they're essentially now trying to compete and secure access from this is probably too strong of a word, but from a losing position where payers are already made a determination that their solutions or their products were not medically necessary, hence not covered. And now you're trying to change their minds. Can it be done? Absolutely. Have manufacturers done it in the past?
Mhm.
Yes. But those instances are few and far between. And the solution in both cases was, I think that they missed the opportunity for that early due diligence to understand what the payer expectations. I can't remember the manufacturer. It may have been Alnylam, but it may have been somebody else. But the CEO in a press release mentioned something along the lines of they intentionally went to payers early in the development process and essentially treated the approach or the process as co-development. So they didn't go in an adversarial manner where you're the payer, you're just going to deny coverage. Instead, they said, hey, this is what we have. We think that it offers value. How do we make sure that patients are able to capture that value and benefit from this product? What data do you need to see to support allowing access to this product? So collaboration instead of an adversarial relationship. And they've been successful. I'm not going to claim that that's going to work in every instance, but the fact that they recognize that they need to have those discussions earlier rather than later and took a more collaborative approach, I think really benefited them, as opposed to the examples that I just cited.
So you have been doing consulting in the commercialization strategy for a while now. If our listeners who are in the industry want to engage you for a conversation, when is the best time to start this dialogue with you on their journey?
Um, once they get out of the lab, and there are even some things that may be beneficial in the discussions because it could inform their investor decks when they're seeking funding. But generally speaking, once they get out of the lab, it's absolutely the time to have those discussions. And again, doesn't need to be cost prohibitive, doesn't need to be time intensive. It's small chunks. The name of the game is incremental progress, and you want to do it in parallel with clinical development. You don't want clinical development to be ahead on the skis or whatever the expression is, ahead of
Mhm.
the access or the commercial considerations.
So you mentioned that you can do it in chunks, but I know that clients usually want some certainty in terms of, is it going to be a 10-week process? Is it going to be a 6 month process? What, how much time does it normally take to put together the strategy
It
for biotech?
it depends. It really does depend on where they are, what the asset is, where they need help. Because, if you're talking about something like CAR T, that's going to look very different than if you're talking about a GLP-1 for obesity. And again, in those earlier stages, it's not the same approach and not the same time frames that you have when you're talking about late phase 2 and phase 3, because you have more data and you're looking for specific concrete things. In the earlier stages, it's just about getting a better understanding and informing some of that later stage clinical development. So those timeframes are going to be considerably shorter. If you're talking about later stage, just as an example, like if you want to optimize your pricing strategy, you're not going to get that done in 4 weeks. It just not. Could it happen? Theoretically, yes, but highly unlikely. In the earlier stages, you can do some secondary research. You could get an understanding of what the pricing landscape looks like for the competition, and you could get some high level guidance in terms of what your pricing may look like. Same thing from an access perspective. What does access look like for your competition? What are the payers' expectations for you to get covered? So those are much shorter timeframes where you're talking about weeks rather than months or years.
And one thing that I would add is it doesn't have to be expensive. And most importantly, if you pay for this upfront, you're going to save a lot of millions of dollars on the back end. So I'm a strategist. I really like providing some checklists, some very pithy points to my clients so that they know exactly what they need to do next. So from the actionable standpoint, can you share a checklist with our audience that they can apply immediately if they are in an early mid-stage company?
Yeah, I already gave away a lot of the items on the checklist. So early bird gets the worm. Earlier the better. I know that there are limitations, but the earlier that you start thinking about it and take those incremental steps, the better off you will be. And again, as we talked about, the exit strategy doesn't matter. If you're commercializing or if you're selling, it doesn't matter. The early intervention is absolutely key. The examples that I brought up, that there is such a thing as too late, and it is exponentially more difficult to pivot and course correct once you get into later stages of development. Clinical development as a whole is not cheap. We all know that we all know what it costs. It's measured in the billions. So as you progress in clinical development, there's more money at stake. That's why I would argue that those small incremental investments in the early stages have some of the best ROI that you will have amongst the initiatives that you may need to take on. The other thing that I think is critically important, and you alluded to it from a cost perspective, I mentioned that that you don't want to cover the entire marathon in one step. The other thing that I think is really important is don't let perfect get in the way of good enough, especially in those early stages. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to inform your strategy and it needs to inform your decision making. And the other component is you won't have all of the data. So there may be some ambiguity, and that's perfectly fine. Don't let that force a delay in you taking action. And then the last thing is don't be afraid to ask for help. I've come across some brilliant individuals, but even they will probably agree that you can't know everything. And given the demands and the rigor and the expectation that they may have from a scientific perspective, I think it's almost unfair to ask them to also have those same type of expectations from a commercial perspective. And that's why I think that it's really important for the unknown unknowns and for areas that you may not be an expert in, ask for help. And that help has to be the right help. Just like in the clinical side, right patient, right drug. Well, it has to be the right consultant that offers that guidance and advice that where there's that strategic fit, and they will give you the information that you need to move forward.
When I engage with clients, my perspective is always I tell clients that they should start with the end in mind. Define that evidence plan early, define that payer aligned TPP, get your payer advice before you start designing your trials. In fact, there were several partners of mine that I actually forced to start engaging the FDA as early as possible, almost introducing them to the FDA people. Another thing is you really need to decide the route to market by phase 2 and start aligning your operating model, your supply, your field strategy accordingly. And make access a board topic. I think the more I engage with the boards, I realize that very few boards actually discuss access and economics at the board level. Start bringing those scenario plans, from the pricing perspective. Start thinking about the net price, contracting. Now we live in an IRA era, right? So we need to really consider the risks across key markets. And finally, from the investor perspective, it's so important to build investor confidence with clear commercialization milestones, clear value story that companies should start thinking upfront, and very capital efficient plans as they continue to go along.
Just really quickly, a couple of the points that you made, I think that excellent points. One about the TPP. So I just think it's a bit odd. If you think from a clinical perspective, right? You don't have an actual product as you're progressing through clinical development. Why is it different from an access perspective, where the perspective that I often hear is, well, we don't have a data to build out a full TPP. So I can't do any research, I can't do any due diligence because we don't have a full TPP. Why? Why is that the case? That has never. It should be the same approach that you take from a clinical perspective, from a scientific perspective, where you test hypotheses and you go to the appropriate stakeholders, whether it's from a regulatory perspective or whether it's from an access perspective, and you test those hypotheses. Yeah, you may not have all the answers, but you can absolutely set up a baseline, downside, upside. There's nothing that's stopping you from doing that. And I think that would really help to shape the thinking and the approach, and again, inform your decision making so you could keep on moving forward. And it will prevent that that struggle, that hesitation to hold off and delay.
So, if our listeners want to find you and to get your advice, how can they reach out to you?
Either LinkedIn or SiriusIntel.com.
Fantastic. Well, Maxime, thank you very much for being my guest today. I think it was a great topic that we covered, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.